Good afternoon. His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, esteemed Consul General of the United States, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, dear students, I am most honored and pleased to welcome you on this historic day, marking the launch of Turkey's first research center for Byzantine studies attached to a public university. We are very proud to have with us today two distinguished speakers, Professors Maria Mavrudi and Dimitar Angelov, who have kindly accepted our invitation to be the guest speakers at this inaugural event. I would like to thank them for being here despite their extremely busy schedules at this time of the academic year. Today, we are celebrating the realization of a long-held dream at Boğaziçi University. Our university, and in particular the Department of History, has played a leading role in advancing the study and teaching of Byzantium in Turkey over the last 25 years. As a matter of fact, Boğaziçi University's engagement with Byzantine studies goes back to the days of Robert College, where Alexander van Milligan, a scholar well known for his books on the Byzantine monuments of Istanbul, taught as professor of history from the 1870s until his death in 1915. Let me just remind you in this context that the building in which we are gathered now is actually named after him, and this very conference hall functioned as the reading room of the Van Milligan Library up until the construction of our present library on the North Campus on the, upon the hill. Yet the seeds of our Byzantine Studies Research Center were laid upon in the year 1999 when Boğaziçi University took a pioneering step by hosting a conference on Byzantine Constantinople, which was the first major international gathering of Byzantinists in Turkey since 1955. Its principal organizer, Nevran Necipoğlu, who is now the director of our center, modestly called it a workshop then. However, it was a 3-day-long conference in which nearly 30 of the world's leading experts on Byzantine Constantinople participated. Thus, looking back, it will be no misjudgment to claim that this landmark conference, with its outstanding scholarly success, represented the first major step towards the realization in 2015 of our goal of founding a research center for Byzantine studies at Boğaziçi. Given Turkey's Byzantine cultural heritage and the legacy of Istanbul as a world city from the time of Byzantine onwards, it should come as a big surprise that a research center directly devoted to Byzantine studies was never established in Turkey or elsewhere in Turkey or in Istanbul until the present year. Filling this void has been a prime motivation for Boğaziçi University's initiative to establish this center, which will capitalize on our past achievements in order to create the Center for Gravity, Center of Creativity and Excellence necessary for fostering research on the crucial yet neglected Byzantine millennium of Turkey's past. Under the expert direction of Nevran Necipoğlu and her excellent team of colleagues, who have already worked so effectively to develop in Turkey Byzantine scholarship of truly international caliber, we expect our new center to flourish and to contribute to the further development of Byzantine studies both in Turkey and around the globe. In her opening speech to follow, Professor Necipoğlu will provide further details on the center's background, goals, mission, and future prospects. I would like to thank every one of you so much for being with us and sharing our pride and joy at this inauguration ceremony. Now I would like to leave the floor to Professor Necipoğlu. Please.
His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, distinguished Consul General of the United States, dear Rector, dear Professor Mavrudi and Professor Angelov, dear guests, colleagues, and students. It is a great pleasure to have you with us on this very special occasion, and please allow me to begin by expressing how excited I feel at this very moment. For what we are celebrating today is indeed the end result of a long journey. The project of establishing a research center dedicated to Byzantine studies at Boğaziçi University has been on our agenda for quite a while. Its realization necessarily took time, as it had to rest on strong foundations which we have been gradually building up over the years. We have in fact come a very long way. Some 20 years ago, opening a course on Byzantine history proved to be a serious challenge due to a form of reluctance and resistance from political and bureaucratic circles. Today, Byzantine history and art history, as well as Greek and Latin language courses, have become a standard component of many students' undergraduate programs. And at the same time, they constitute an area of specialization for our graduate students of the MA and PhD level. Hence, the ground was set and conditions ripe for the Byzantine Studies Research Center being launched today. This undertaking hardly requires any justification or rationalization before the present audience. Nonetheless, a few reminders about the importance of Byzantine civilization in global context, as well as in the context of Turkey's heritage, Turkey's historical heritage, may be useful. Standing at the intersection of different epochs and geographies simultaneously, the Byzantine Empire may be defined as the pre-modern global civilization par excellence. From the inauguration of Constantinople in 330 until its fall to the Ottomans in 1453, the Byzantine capital city was the setting of a truly vibrant political, religious, and cultural life, which extended its influence across the continents of Asia, Europe, and Africa. Even after the empire became reduced territorially, its culture, its imperial and legal traditions, its religion, and its artistic and architectural forms continued to have far-reaching effects throughout the Orthodox world, in Western Europe, and in Islamic lands, both before 1453 and afterwards. Indeed, Byzantine art and literature are still inspiring creative minds in contemporary art scenes, literary circles, and fashion business across the globe. In the particular context of Turkey, let us simply remember that virtually all the lands of the Ottoman Empire were once Byzantine. On a much smaller scale, modern Turkey, which is founded on territories that made up the nucleus of the Byzantine Empire, including its capital city Constantinople and Anatolia, has inherited much from Byzantium, geographically as well as historically and culturally. Yet, despite the undeniable fact that knowledge of Byzantine civilization can lead to a better understanding of Eastern Mediterranean, Eurasian, and Turkish history, and despite also the unique position of Istanbul as the former seat of the Byzantine imperial capital for over a millennium, Byzantine studies have long remained neglected in Turkey. It is only in recent decades that notable progress has been made in this academic field, as a result of which the Byzantine heritage of Turkey is now being acknowledged more widely than ever before, both within and outside academia, while also interest in and awareness of Byzantine civilization are also building up in the country. These positive developments may in part be attributed to the persistent efforts of Boğaziçi University in actively promoting the study and teaching of Byzantium over the past 25 years. In this respect, we attach particular significance to the International Conference on Byzantine Constantinople, organized in 1999 by Boğaziçi University with the collaboration of IFEA, of the Institut Français d'Études Anatoliennes, to which Professor Barbarosoğlu already referred. This is the poster from that conference. That conference, by the way, was also held in this very room, and since its former function as the Van Millingen Library reading room has been brought up by our rector, here is a photograph from those days. That's the same room. Now, only 5 years before the Byzantine Constantinople Conference at Boğaziçi, and I return to our beautiful poster from those days, only 5 years before the Byzantine Constantinople Conference at Boğaziçi, a similar event being organized by another institution in Istanbul had been cancelled by its organizers with only 1 month's notice because of prevailing prejudices against Byzantium, traditionally considered a taboo subject in Turkish society and academia. Thus, the 1999 conference held at Boğaziçi University proved to be a milestone event, helping overcome to a large extent the long-held phobia of the Byzantine Empire and its legacy, at least in the academic arena, thereby setting an example and paving the way for future Byzantine studies conferences that would be organized from 2003 onwards by other Turkish universities and cultural institutions. And here is the publication from our 1999 conference, the publication that resulted from that conference. In fact, since 2007, there is even a regular and institutionalized Byzantine Studies Symposium, which is being held in Istanbul every 3 years, namely the International Sevgi Gönül Studies Symposium, the 4th of which is scheduled to take place this coming June. At Boğaziçi University, on the other hand, the outstanding scholarly success of the Conference on Byzantine Constantinople became the initial source of inspiration for the research center that we are inaugurating today. While many research centers for Byzantine studies exist throughout the world, Istanbul lacked such a center until the present year, which actually saw the establishment not only of one, but of 2 centers, the other one being the Koç University Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Late Antique and Byzantine Studies, which celebrated its inauguration only 10 days ago. The aim of our newly established center at Boğaziçi University is to contribute to the development of Byzantine studies by actively promoting interdisciplinary research and graduate education in this field, by enabling exchanges and collaborations with leading national and international institutions, and by serving as a meeting ground, as a meeting point for discussion and dialogue on research conducted by Turkish and international Byzantine historians, art and architectural historians, archaeologists, literary historians, and philologists. The center's missions encompass encouraging young scholars in Turkey to conduct research on Byzantium, providing support for ongoing studies, and promoting an intellectual atmosphere conducive to debate and scholarly exchange among native and foreign researchers. Through research directed at Byzantine history, culture, art, and archaeology, the center will contribute to scholarship on Istanbul's late antique and medieval past, Anatolia and Balkans in the Middle Ages, as well as the early Ottoman Empire. In this respect, besides our university's Byzantinist faculty, the presence of a large pool of other faculty members working and teaching in complementary areas is quite significant for our purposes. These include specialists of medieval Islamic history and art, Selçukid Anatolia, post-Byzantine Constantinople, and early Ottoman history and art history, among others, who will contribute to the center actively and broaden its scope by opening up new avenues of research on Byzantium's wider points of contact, and particularly on the important topic of the transition from the Byzantine to the Ottoman world. And I think this is one of the major points which will make our center different from all the other centers established throughout the world. The center will support research related to Byzantine civilization through the organization of national and international conferences, workshops, lecture series, and seminars, and also through publications. The center will also give priority to projects directed towards disseminating and preserving Turkey's rich Byzantine cultural heritage. A unique advantage which a Byzantine Studies Center set in the historic heart of the Byzantine Empire will provide to researchers is direct access to the material remains of Byzantine culture in and around Istanbul and beyond. Thus, the Boğaziçi University Center is expected to serve as a magnet for visiting scholars and postdoctoral researchers, as well as MA and PhD students working in all areas related to the Byzantine civilization. Besides supporting and promoting the teaching of Byzantium at Boğaziçi University, the center will focus on fostering joint studies and research projects with other universities in Turkey and abroad. Enhancing the current level of instruction in the essential research languages, such as ancient and medieval Greek or Latin, and organizing in the future summer schools on Byzantine Greek and training seminars on Byzantine paleography, codicology, numismatics, and sigillography are also on the center's agenda. Boğaziçi University's partnership with Columbia University in collaborative projects based in Istanbul, such as the joint summer school on Byzantine and Ottoman Istanbul, launched in 2013, and the semester abroad program, which began in the spring of 2015 within the framework of Columbia's Mellon Global Liberal Arts Initiative in Byzantine Studies, will no doubt provide additional strength to the center. We envision the activities of the center to benefit not only students and academics, but also the public at large in Turkey. Projects such as exhibitions, popular talks, and educational collaboration with museums will be geared towards enhancing the image of Byzantium and knowledge of its culture among the Turkish public. The website of our center, which is currently under construction and which will become available very soon, will also serve as a platform for the dissemination of knowledge about Byzantium to the general public. In line with its goals, the center plans to cooperate with governmental and non-governmental organizations and other institutions, including the Turkish Ministry of Culture, the Turkish Historical Society, and the History Foundation. The center's first major activity after this inauguration will be a national conference entitled Byzantine Studies in Turkey, New Research, Different Trends, which is going to take place on March 18th and 19th. We attach great importance to this initiative, which will usefully serve as a meeting ground for postdoctoral Byzantine scholars working in Turkey to present their research and exchange their ideas. In concluding, there is no reason why Istanbul, the historic site of the Byzantine imperial capital, should not fulfill its predestined role to become one of the great contemporary centers of Byzantine scholarship. We believe that the Boğaziçi University Byzantine Studies Research Center will contribute immensely to this goal, taking one step further the pioneering role Boğaziçi has played in the development of Byzantine studies in Turkey. And on a final note, I would like to mention, by way of commemoration, two people who would have been immensely proud and happy had they lived long enough to see this day. The first is Professor Angelik Ilayu, my dear mentor and thesis supervisor at Harvard, one of the world's leading Byzantine historians, who passed away unexpectedly in 2008, leaving a huge vacuum within our discipline. It is noteworthy that our two main speakers today, Professors Angelov and Mavrudi, as well as the vice director of our center, Assistant Professor Koray Durak, all shared the privilege of having studied with her at Harvard, which is proof of her continuing impact and legacy, to which I wish to pay tribute in the presence of all here. We still grieve at her loss and remember her with respect and fondness. Secondly, our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Vangelis Kehriotis, from the Department of History, whose untimely passing in August, following a fatal illness we are still mourning, was a valued member of the advisory board of our center. Sadly, the very last email message he sent from the hospital to the Boğaziçi Instructors Forum list contained an interview of mine published in a Turkish daily newspaper about the center, which he so enthusiastically supported. I regret that the center will not be able to benefit from the valuable contributions he would have made. Finally, I wish to express my sincere gratitude and thanks to all those who made the establishment of this center possible. I thank first and foremost our rector, Professor Gülay Barbarosoğlu, without whose support and dedication to this goal we would not have been celebrating here today. I am also grateful to the Boğaziçi University administration, to the Dean of our Faculty of Arts and Sciences, my colleagues at the Department of History, our center's board of directors, and also the center's advisory board members, and last but not least, the Onassis Foundation, which has over the years been supporting Hellenic studies at Boğaziçi University, including instruction in Greek language and Byzantine history and art history. And now, time to introduce our first speaker today, Professor Dimitar Angelov. Well, I am going to say a few words about him, with your permission. I know you are all dying to hear him, but some information about him and his achievements. Well, after being trained as both a Byzantine and medieval historian at Harvard, where he received his PhD degree in 2002, Dimitar Angelov was assistant professor of medieval history at Western Michigan University during the years 2002 and 2005, and in 2006 he joined the University of Birmingham. Between 2012 and 2015, he was a visiting associate professor at Harvard University's Department of History, and in 2015 he has now been appointed the Dumbarton Oaks Professor of Byzantine History, filling the chair once filled by our advisor, Professor Angeliki Layu. Dimitar Angelov's research and teaching interests lie in the intellectual, political, and institutional history of the Byzantine Empire, with a particular focus on the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. He works mostly with textual and literary sources. His book on imperial ideology and political thought in Byzantium during the 13th and 14th centuries, published by Cambridge University Press in 2007, examined a wide variety of little-known texts in order to shed light on the political imagination of the Byzantines, who saw their empire being transformed into a second-rate power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Professor Angelov is currently working on a monograph on the Byzantine crown prince, emperor, and philosopher Theodore II Laskaris of Nicaea, to which also his lecture devoted. This study, his study makes use of the analytical and discursive this study makes use of the analytical and discursive potential of the genre of historical biography in order to open a broader vista on the transformation of Byzantine culture after the fall of Constantinople to the Latins in 1204. His other projects and research interests include the edition and translation of works by Theodore II Lascaris, the history of political and social thought in Byzantium, the study of geographical notions in Byzantium, and the history of the High and Late Medieval Balkans. Professor Angelo has also co-edited several volumes and has written many articles, which are too numerous to enumerate here. Among his awards, he has been both a junior fellow and fellow at Dumbarton Oaks in the past, and he has also been the recipient of a Bliss Fellowship from Dumbarton Oaks as well. In 2003-2005, he was the recipient of a Marie Curie Fellowships in the history of political thought from the European Commission. So now I would like to invite Professor Angelov here to deliver his lecture.
Which one is it? Yeah. This way, first one.
No, but we missed
This one.
that one.
This one? Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
And then you move on.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Necipoglu, for your kind invitation. Your All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, esteemed Consul General of the United States to Istanbul, dear Rector, dear guests, I'm delighted to be at Boğaziçi University for the first time during such an important event for the field of Byzantine studies. I have always felt a special affinity to the history of your institution, and I thought I would immerse you into the atmosphere of the past, not the Byzantine past, but the past of Robert College and the American College for Girls, by showing you a photograph from my family archive, one which I discovered just a month ago, which I have passed to Professor Necipoglu. Oops, not this one. Definitely not this one. Yes, I think we managed to lose the order.
Okay, let's close this.
Definitely not from my... I wish that I belonged to Byzantine royalty, but...
Okay, let's open it once again.
And maybe you can start.
Now start it.
Great, thank you. I think this is the photograph I wanted to show you. Thank you very much, Professor Necipoglu. It's a photograph which I have passed on to you for the inclusion into the university archives. These are students in the American College for Girls in around 1908, one of whom happens to be my great-grandmother, who, along with her two sisters, traveled all the way from the Bulgarian part of the Dobruja to attend the American College for Girls. Times have changed greatly since 1908, including the way that college girls dress these days. And my talk today is going to be a period of intense cultural change. During its millennial history, the Byzantine Empire saw very many transformations, some gradual and unnoticed by contemporaries, others more abrupt, dramatic, and well remembered. Among those later changes was that caused by the fall of Constantinople to the Crusaders on the night of the 12th of April, 1204. The Byzantine world in the 13th century was marked by territorial fragmentation, by the dislocation of individuals who moved away from areas under Latin control, by the discontinuity of educational institutions, and by disruption of economic patterns of production and exchange. The Byzantine state, or rather states, after 1204, was a relatively minor player in international politics, surrounded by expanding powers, such as the Latins of Constantinople, the Seljukids of Rome, the Bulgarians of Turnovo, powers which themselves either collapsed or were turned into minor states in the 13th century. The period was clearly one of great political complexity. The emperor, philosopher, theologian, and hymnographer Theodore Lascaris was a key figure in Byzantium in the 13th century and was a keen observer and commentator on the complex world that emerged in the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade. He had a lot to say about Anatolia, both Byzantine Anatolia but also Seljukid Anatolia, and about the Latin West. His writings reveal a continuing search for identity by a member of the Byzantine royal elite in response to new and unusual historical circumstances. So Theodore Lascaris was the ruler of the Empire of Nicaea, one of the three main successor states to the Byzantine Empire, formed in the aftermath of the Latin conquest of Constantinople, namely the Empire of Nicaea in Western Asia Minor, the Empire of Trebizond, centered in the Pontus region of Asia Minor along the Black Sea, and thirdly, the state of Epirus or Epirus Thessaloniki in the Balkans. And you can see on this map the Empire of Nicaea. This map reflects the configurations of political powers around the year 1214, and the Empire of Nicaea is in dark gray with a red arrow pointing at it, and it's located in Western Asia Minor. And to fast forward time, if we could, 43 years later in 1257, 1 year before the death of Theodore Lascaris, the Empire of Nicaea had expanded into the Balkans and was poised to recover Constantinople from the Latins. Born in the year 1221 or 1222 in the imperial palace in the city of Nicaea, modern Iznik, as the only child in the family of the Nicaean emperor John Vatatzis, Theodore was brought up as heir to the throne and was elevated to the position of uncrowned co-emperor in his childhood, certainly by the time that he was 14. The main events of his life emerge from his writings. We see him at the age of 18 commencing his higher education in philosophical disciplines, something which his tutor at the court discouraged, favoring instead military and practical training. After all, if you're an emperor, you are supposed to lead the army, not to know too much. We see him throughout his 20s, when he already had official duties, discussing philosophy with his two main teachers. In his 20s, he developed interests in mathematics and soon began writing on natural, ethical, and political philosophy. At the age of 29, he mused over the difficult task of kings, whose destiny, he thought, was to incur the hatred of their subjects, using as a pretext for this little political tract the death of the excommunicated Western Emperor Frederick II Hohenstaufen, whose daughter was Theodore's stepmother and was residing in the court in Nicaea at that time. Now, Frederick II, who was much maligned by the papacy, was the only Western ruler to whom Theodore could relate and whose fate, to a certain degree, taught him a lesson. At the age of 30, we see him musing about human existence and the meaning of love after the death of his wife, a Bulgarian princess who was 2 years younger than him. At 32, he accedes to the throne as the sole and now crowned emperor, almost immediately embarking on a 2-year campaign in the Balkans. And now to go to the slide that accidentally was shown in the very beginning, these are two portraits of the man himself, a typically clothed Byzantine emperor with a lauros, or bejeweled scarf, wearing a crown. These two portraits found in a 15th century manuscript, the portrait on your left and an early modern drawing on your right, they all go back to this 14th century image in the history of George Pachymeris, a Byzantine historian, which itself, it's slightly damaged, as you can see, goes back to an official portrait of the emperor. At the age of 36, Lascaris passed away in the imperial palace in Magnesia, or modern Manisa, missing the almost bloodless Byzantine recapture of Constantinople by less than 3 years. His domestic reforms upset the established aristocratic families in the Empire of Nicaea to such a degree that within months of his death, the champion of the threatened families, Michael Palaeologus, usurped the throne and founded the Palaeologus dynasty that was to rule Constantinople until 1453. Theodore's style and sensibilities leave the impression of an emotional and sometimes impulsive young man with a sense of humor that was both subtly ironic and darkly sarcastic. One of the salient emotions displayed in his letter is his deep attachment to Anatolia and to specific places in Anatolia. This is explicable, in part, with his official responsibilities to travel and to conduct inspections in this area. He did not cross the Dardanelles until he had to lead a campaign in the Balkans 4 years before his death. His life on the move was hardly the traditional one for a Byzantine prince and emperor. Until the 12th century, Byzantium had been unique in the Christian medieval world for having a fixed capital, Constantinople, which was the seat of the central government, the treasury, and the mint. In the 13th century, itinerancy, or royal itinerancy, became the rule, however, and was connected with the methods of governance and administration. The emperors in exile in Western Anatolia resided in different residences, called palaces in our textual sources, and when they resided in these palaces, they used the local resources, consumed the food, such as meat and wine, derived from estates attached to the palaces. The literary sources tell us about 5 such palaces in Nicaea, that is Iznik, in Nymphaeum, Kemal Pasha, in Magnesia or Manisa, in Smyrna or Izmir, and in Philadelphia, Alashahir, and there certainly were more residences. Archaeologists, as far as I know, are yet to identify these palaces, with the exception of the structure that survives in Nymphaeum. Here it is, a single block, tall building featuring an elaborate bathing facility underneath, from which we know that the royal elite of Nicaea loved to bathe. Theodore resided during his travels also in large and elaborate tents, of which we have literary descriptions. There were also inns and facilities for travelers, sponsored by the Nicaean emperors. The duty of Lascaris as an uncrowned co-emperor throughout the 1240s and the early 1250s was to carry out inspections in cities and villages, to receive petitions in person or in writing, and to exercise law justice, while high justice in criminal cases was the preserve of his father, with whom he sometimes held court jointly. When his father, the senior emperor, was on campaign in the Balkans, something which happened quite often in the decade of the 1240s, Theodore had the duty of carrying out the business of government in Asia Minor, of reporting back to his father on affairs arising, and following developments along the eastern frontier, especially the prospect of a dreaded Mongol invasion. To use a phrase coined by the Byzantinist Michael Angold, Theodore Lascaris was a sort of viceroy of Anatolia, like the viceroy of India in the British Empire, even though there are some significant differences here on which I would not dwell at the moment. In his letters, Theodore often refers to arriving or departing from the cities of Nicaea and Nymphaeum, that is Iznik and Kemal Pasha. This agrees with what other sources tell us, namely that the senior emperor John Vatatzis preferred to spend his summer in Nicaea, which was also where the patriarch resided, and from where he could plan campaigns against the Latins in the Balkans, and that he spent his winters in Nymphaeum, where the temperature was somewhat higher. It's still a bit higher today, as you can find from weather forecasts, and whose vicinity in whose vicinity, that is of Nymphaeum, there was a lot of grazing land for the imperial horses to gain strength in preparation for the campaign season. If we put on a map the locations visited by Theodore Lascaris according to his correspondence, we see a large section of Western Asia Minor, mostly along the coastal areas, along the Aegean and along the Dardanelles, but also inland along the major river valleys. What unfortunately is impossible to map is the seasonality of travel, because the letters do not give us an indication as to the time or season when they were written. There are obvious parallels here with the itinerant kingship and palaces built by the famous Seljuk Sultan, Ala al-Din Kaykubat I, who was Lascaris' elder contemporary. And what seems to have been different was some of the rationale for royal travel. According to a Seljuk historian, Andrew Peacock, Kaykubat I traveled often in order to intervene with Turkoman tribes in Eastern Asia Minor, which was not something that Theodore Lascaris, as far as we know, experienced. To give you a sense of Theodore's emotional language about Anatolia, let me refer you just in the beginning to the phrase, the Holy Land, my mother Anatolia, found in an official newsletter that he wrote in July 1256, which announced to his subjects in Asia Minor the provisions of a peace treaty. That Asia Minor should be presented as the Holy Land may seem strange to us at first, but in fact it fits well with the patriotic public rhetoric in the Empire of Nicaea, the rhetoric we find in patriarchal sermons or in court orations. The Greek word Anatolia, Anatoli, means sunrise, and the east, that is the land east of Constantinople. The east had connotations of holiness in Christian religious discourse. The east was the direction of the resurrection, of the Garden of Eden. The earthly paradise lay in the east, and the Byzantines prayed in easterly direction. This semantics of the holiness of the east was conveniently exploited with the move of the court to Anatolia. In addition to the newsletter, let me also refer you to a private letter of Theodore Lascaris addressed to an imperial secretary, where he describes Anatolia as his fatherland and mentions his travels throughout what he calls the best part of Asia. Some of his contemporaries, he writes, praised Anatolia for its fertile soil, others for its fruit trees and abundance of vineyards, for its rivers and mountains, yet others prefer to praise its beautiful shoreline and proximity to the sea. And Theodore himself often commented on the fertility of the land of Western Anatolia, describing, for example, the countless olive trees growing along the coast, or the annual agricultural cycle, which he in fact embedded into the structure of a philosophical treatise on nature. One gains the strong impression, which is also confirmed by other sources, that the Empire of Nicaea had agricultural wealth and the emperors cared about agriculture. By contrast, he viewed the Balkans as a foreign and exotic land. In a campaign letter from the Balkans addressed to his childhood friend and political protege at the time, he complained endlessly that he could not hunt for his favorite hunting trophies, for example, herons or wildcats, as he was used to do in Anatolia, that he could not find the same fruits, that the climate was extreme, and that he was surrounded by barbarians. And this view of the Balkans as a foreign and hostile land was intertwined with a similarly hostile opinion of his main political enemies, the Latins, and to a lesser extent the Bulgarians, with whom he fought a war. The one fascination he had with the Balkans was with areas of memory connected with the figure of Alexander, who was for him the most important model ruler. When he passed through the town and fortress of Philippi in eastern Macedonia, he thought that he was entering the land of ancient fame of Philip and Alexander, probably because he was told by locals that some of the surviving monuments date for the times of the kings of ancient Macedonia. Now, to return to the letter addressed to his secretary after noting that his contemporaries praised the natural features of Anatolia, Theodore says that he preferred to attribute the special distinction of Anatolia to its people, or as he called them, the community of good people of Anatolia. And it is important to note that the family Lascaris was of Anatolian origin himself. The name was derived most probably from the Persian personal name al-Ashkari, although there are other theories about its origin. And my own hypothesis, which is as much plausible as it is speculative, is that the 13th century ruling family of Nicaea descended from a member of the Shaddadid royal family of Kurdish origin governing Dvin in Armenia. In the 11th century, the son of a certain al-Ashkari ben Musa from Dvin entered Byzantine service, was converted to Christianity, and his seal identifies him as the son of Lascaris, namely it Byzantinizes its name. And this is in fact a depiction of this seal, which was discovered on the Danube frontier in modern Serbia of Byzantium, so it belongs to the late 11th century. And this was the first stage of the development of an aristocratic surname. It was a standard practice in Byzantium for aristocratic surnames to develop from the first name of a foreigner who entered Byzantine service. Hence, we have the family name Raoul from the Latin Rudolphus, Tornicius from the Armenian Tornik, Nestongos from the Slavic Nestong. By the late 12th century, lead seals show that the Lascaris family was connected with the Kaistros Valley in Anatolia and was thoroughly Byzantinized. Seals of the two senior representatives of the Lascaris family feature an iconographic type of Saint George, which was associated with a monastery in Pyrgion, Birgi, in the Kaistros Valley. The Anatolian connections of the Lascaris family serve to explain the flight of Theodore's grandfather, the first emperor Theodore Lascaris, on the eve of the fall of Constantinople to the Crusaders, and escape to Asia Minor rather than to the Balkans. And it is perhaps notable that the 12th century imperial family of the Angeli, from whom Theodore Lascaris, our subject today, descended through his maternal grandmother, was also connected to Asia Minor, in this case with Philadelphia. The general pattern of the Byzantine aristocracy, in fact, in the 11th and the 12th century, as observed by historian Jean-Claude Chenet, was for most families to originate from Anatolia rather than from the Balkans. At the same time, the distinction between Anatolia and the Balkans, as well as between Anatolia and Constantinople, is not a very clear-cut one, because families tended to move from time to time. And many of the individuals whom Theodore promoted during his short reign were born in Anatolia, but some belonged to families that in the past had centuries of close connections with Constantinople. Now, what did Theodore Lascaris think of specific places he saw in Asia Minor? The city of Nicaea was his birthplace, and he even described himself rhetorically as a Nicaean. In his encomium on Nicaea, he admired its impressive fortifications, its two circuits of walls. These are photographs from Iznik, and the tower that you see on the upper left, in fact, was one erected by Theodore Lascaris' grandfather. He admired the walls, he admired the schools, the ready availability of water in every house. So obviously there was a functioning aqueduct system, the fertile land, both outside Nicaea and in Nicaea. And just like his father, the senior emperor, he displayed on his coins and on his seals the figure of Saint Tryphon, a saint who was believed to have been martyred in Nicaea, and the blooming of the winter lilies on Lake Iznik, Lake Ascania, was seen as an annual miracle performed by the saint in early February each year. Theodore saw the saint in his dreams, wrote a vita of the saint and a hymnographic text in his honor, and reconstructed the church of Tryphon in Nicaea, where he endowed a school of grammar. Another city which Theodore visited for a prolonged period of time was Ephesus. because he attended classes there with one of his main teachers, Nikiforos Vlemidis, who was the abbot of a monastery near Ephesus. He describes Ephesus as a busy market town with fishmongers, butchers, money changers, and tavern owners. Ephesus was a large and important metropolitan bishopric, controlling a number of local bishops in its vicinity, including the Bishop of Magnesia. And Theodore, ironically, had a particular dislike for the metropolitan bishop of Ephesus, whom he considered to be too money-loving for a clergyman and lacking the necessary appreciation for learning. Philadelphia, Alashehir, was a border city near the frontier with the Sultanate of Rum, stationed with soldiers who were experts in archery. Theodore mentioned Philadelphia as the center of leather production and shoemaking, and cared enough about the city to advise its metropolitan bishop to build a bathhouse in a monastery that he had just founded in or around Philadelphia. And this advice is symptomatic of the interest in public welfare by the Nicene emperors. For example, storage facilities for grain, weapons depots were built in cities to improve their capacity to withstand Mongol invasion. Peasants were settled in estates near the cities in order to help with provisioning them. There was a concern with education of the urban population, and we hear of a policy of collecting books and depositing them in urban libraries, a measure about whose details we unfortunately are poorly informed, but this seems to resemble public libraries. Now, areas in Seljuk Asia Minor and beyond the Seljuks appear also in passing in his works. He knew by oral reports that 10 or more days were needed for one to travel from Trebizond to Tarsus. Cappadocia was for him the eye of Asia, and he made Saint Tryphon to originate from Cappadocia rather than from Phrygia, which is what is found in earlier versions of the hagiographical story. The importance he assigned to Cappadocia reflects the close connections between the Cappadocian Orthodox communities and the Patriarch in Nicaea, connections witnessed by epigraphic evidence, by the presidents of the Metropolitan of Caesarea in the meetings of the Patriarchal Synod, by the decisions of the Patriarchate on canonical matters pertaining to Christians in the Sultanate. And in fact, one of Theodore's maternal uncles from the Lascaris family spent at least some period of a very long exile in Cappadocia. The degree to which Theodore knew about lands further east is quite uncertain. We hear the voice of oral reports to travelers when he states that the climate of Syria, by which he probably means the entire Near East, was very harmful for travelers who fell ill because of the heavy metallic character in the air. India was a rich and exotic land, and he read the descriptions of its fantastic animals in the 6th century Christian topography attributed to Cosmas Indikoplevstis. There is nearly full silence about the Mongols, apart from a few fleeting mentions, and this is an uneasy silence, for Theodore spent many years of his life preparing his subjects for an imminent Mongol invasion, which ironically never happened in Western Anatolia. The Mongols had a reputation for cruelty in Nicaea, and there were stories circulating that they were monsters or cannibals. So there was quite an ignorance about the enemy further east. In the late 1240s and in the 1250s, when we can hear Theodore's voice, he gives the impression of a relatively stable, peaceful, and easily crossable frontier with the Sultanate of Rum. Relations between the Empire of Nicaea and the Sultanate were marked by defensive agreements aimed to create a common front of resistance against the Mongols. Theodore presented the Persians, as he called the Seljuk Turks, as no longer the great power they had once been. In a speech in praise of his father, written between 1250 and 1252, 7 years or more after the disastrous Battle of Kyosedak, fought in 1243, which made the Sultanate a tributary state subordinated to the Mongols, he remembered how in the past his father, John Vatatzis, had paid tribute to the Sultan, probably referring to arrangements during the times of Al-al-Din Kaikobat, Relations between the two powers had now turned a full circle. The Seljuk Turks were the victims of the Mongols, and his father's diplomatic dealings prevented the Mongol campaigns in Anatolia, which is why the Seljuks allegedly praised John Vatatzis as their savior and protector. Now, these tendentious words echo the defensive alliance between the two powers, as well as specific diplomacy with the Mongols. And Theodore refers on one occasion to the movement of Turkomans across the frontier. These Turkomans were resettled away from the frontier in accordance with the traditional Byzantine policy of the transfer of populations, while Christianized Cumans, Turkic-speaking Cumans, were settled along the frontier as border soldiers. In October 1256, the Sultanate of Rum suffered another heavy defeat at the hands of the Mongols. The young Sultan Izaldin Kaikavuz II was defeated at the Battle of Aksaray and fled to the Empire of Nicaea, one of the two flights to Byzantium that this Sultan undertook. Theodore's reaction was marked by opportunism and a continuing diplomatic effort to forestall a Mongol invasion. He welcomed the Sultan, assisting him with troops led by a Nicaean commander, and received in return 4 border fortresses along the Meander Valley. His letter, written on the occasion, speaks of the subjection of the great ruler of the Persians under the authority of the Hellenic tribe and about jubilation in the Roman state. Theodore articulated clearly in the letter the view of his polity as both Roman and Hellenic, an aspect of his thought to which I will return. While assisting the Sultan Izaldin, Theodore arranged for the reception of Mongol ambassadors dispatched by Hulegü in an elaborately staged reception according to the best Byzantine tradition, whose goal was to deceive the Mongols that the Nicaean army was more numerous and the Nicaean land more mountainous than it actually was. Theodore's writings on the Latin West present a rather different picture. He cared to comment on the Latins much more than he did on the Seljuk Turks because he viewed the Latins as his main military enemy and an intellectual rival. The traumatic Latin sack of Constantinople in 1204 was part of living memory, and he writes that he grew up with stories about the 12th century court, stories about the tragic fall of the city, and he often speaks about a just revenge against the Latins, taking pride in their expulsion from Western Asia Minor and making vindictive comments. He took a rigid and rather uncompromising line in theological disputations on the procession of the Holy Spirit, which is the main doctrinal difference with the Latin Church, disagreeing with the more conciliatory spirit of his teacher Nicephorus Vlamidis and preferring the traditional view of Patriarch Photius articulated in the 9th century. For Theodore, the Latins were competitors in the pursuit of philosophy and rivals for the inheritance of classical tradition. He wrote in a letter that students of his own time learned only under pressure and they desired philosophy only at times of trouble or necessity, a situation worthy of bitter joy. On this basis, Theodore wrote, I estimate that philosophy will depart from us, for she belongs to the Hellenes, by whom now she is dishonored as a foreigner, in order to attach itself to the barbarians and glorify them. His attitude to the ongoing process of transmission of works of ancient Greek philosophy to the Latin West was notably mixed. He was deeply proud that his culture was in the privileged position of being the keeper and guardian of philosophy. In an oration composed during or shortly after a disputation with Dominican friars held in Thessalonica in September and October 1256, this is his second oration against the Latins, Theodore stressed that philosophy originated from among the Hellenes and presented the contemporary Hellenes as the cultural, geographical, and even biological heirs to the ancient Hellenes. He gave a long list of Hellenic philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, late antique Neoplatonists, and authors of oracles and astrological prophecies. This pride in Hellenic philosophy was combined with a lurking apprehension that the Latins might outdo the Byzantines in the study of philosophy or might misinterpret and misapply ancient Greek philosophy. In the autumn of 1253, Theodore Lascaris received the embassy of Berthold von Hohenburg, the one-time right-hand man of Frederick II Hohenstaufen, who came along with scholars and doctors and took part in disputes on a series of philosophical subjects. Theodore Lascaris claimed that the Hellenes were victorious and the Latins were defeated, something not to be surprised, noting that the Latins were drawing on the wisdom of the Hellenes. And it is in this period that Bartholomew of Messina and William of Merbeke, who is attested visiting Nicaea not long after Theodore's death, produced important translations of Aristotelian, pseudo-Aristotelian, and other texts. And in a letter commenting on Berthold's embassy, Theodore wrote that, I quote, "The things that are done in this way have brought fame to the Romans," that is to the Byzantines, "and to those who will carry their fame far and wide," that is the Latins, "unless," he added, "the Latins are unable to understand Aristotelian philosophy due to its obscurity." And Theodore considered the Western use of Aristotelian syllogistic logic in theology to be the leading example of how there was a misunderstanding in the West of the goals of philosophy. Through religious and philosophical disputations in which he took part, Theodore Lascaris was sufficiently familiar with scholasticism, the dominant mode of instruction and theological writing in the West in the 13th century. His main intellectual objection against scholasticism was that syllogisms and syllogistic conclusions, which consist of a subject and a predicate, were reached with the help of a middle term used in the premises. This middle term was non-scriptural, hence it served to distort the word of God. This kind of objection, I'm told by historians of Byzantine philosophy, is unique in the debates on the use of logic in Byzantium. In addition, Theodore argued that the multiple semantics of words meant that words cannot give a definition of the divine or serve as solid markers of meaning in theological syllogisms. For all this, Theodore deserves to be viewed as a predecessor of a wider anti-logical movement in Byzantium in the 14th century, whose main proponent was the historian and philosopher Nikephoros Gregoras. In a letter to a Roman cardinal, Theodore explained his objection to the improper Western mixture of philosophy and theology by referring to the apophatic tradition of Byzantine theology. God is unknowable, and the very unknowability of God is a basis for seeking a mystical union with God. He derived this view from the much-admired 4th century Christian Neoplatonic philosopher known to us as Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. Theodore's dislike for scholasticism contributed to his peculiar approach to theology, which is seen in some of the 8 books of his collection on Christian theology, an approach for which he drew criticism by contemporaries, including by his teacher. He did favor philosophical discussion in theological context, but turned away from logic and toward mathematics and geometry. This new approach manifested itself in different ways. He used number symbolisms, endowing every single number until 10 with symbolic meaning. He used arithmetical combinations to establish 92 possible human types in his philosophical treatise on the natural communion. He used reasoning based on proportions and ratios. And most importantly, he used geometrical drawings and diagrams. And his manuscripts are filled, manuscripts of his works were filled with such geometrical drawings and diagrams. For example, in the 3rd book on Christian theology, he used a diagram of 3 overlapping circles, each symbolizing a key concept, in order to demonstrate the relationship between the different personages of the Trinity. To show you just one drawing from a manuscript, and a unique manuscript, which was produced in Theodore's lifetime, and you see the luxurious diagram and the use of gold, so it was a very expensive production. This is a manuscript on the natural communion. It's a manuscript now in Paris. And this is a drawing of the 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire, while in the middle, signified by the Greek letter F, is nature. So elements closer to each other in the drawing have a higher propensity to mix, and there are a number of other arguments that he makes on the basis of such geometrical drawing. The most widely known aspect of Theodore's thought, for which he is known especially in popular books, is his pride and his Hellenic identity, which was a rare occurrence in Byzantium, where the word Hellene, as many of you know, had connotations of paganism. Here, too, Theodore's sense of rivalry with the West, whether rivalry on the battlefield, in philosophical disputations, or in religious polemics, inspired him to explore Hellenism as a distinct feature of his own culture, because it served to show the superiority of his own culture. At the same time, Theodore never abandoned his Roman political identity, but he used Roman and Hellene side by side or even interchangeably. For example, the Roman army, mentioned in his newsletter addressed to his subjects in Anatolia, becomes the Hellenic army in a private letter. One is left with the impression that Theodore chose one term or the other on the basis of the context, and the context of rivalry with the Latins mattered a great deal. What I would like to stress here is that this search for a different or differently articulated identity is the direct product of the historical reality of the reconstitution of the Byzantine polity, the Byzantine imperial polity, outside Constantinople. The fact that the Byzantium was outside Constantinople mattered a great deal. Hellenic identity and Anatolian identity were, in fact, constructs that crossed paths in 3 interesting ways. For one, Hellenism colored, in a way unusual for Byzantium, the presentation of cities that he visited in Anatolia. On visiting Pergamum, for example, which was an important fortified city in Byzantium after the 12th century, he wrote an eloquent letter on the antique remains, which he described as Hellenic, and which he contrasted with the humble contemporary buildings. Referring to an arched bridge and a building that he calls the theater, he exclaimed that these astonishing structures could not be the work of, I quote, a contemporary hand, nor the concept of a contemporary mind. He adds that, I quote, the city displays them in order to reproach us as descendants with the greatness of our ancestral fame, end quote. There is a visible sense of cultural anxiety and even insecurity. Another such city which served as a place of memory was Miletus, about which he reports in his treatise on the natural communion that its inhabitants excelled in war battles, in naval warfare. He seems to be referring to the ancient seafaring Milesians rather than the inhabitants of Byzantine Palatia, which is the name of Miletus in the 13th century and which was a relatively important fortress. Theodore certainly visited the remains of Troy, that is the Hellenistic city of Alexandria Troas, whose ruins were very well visible in the Middle Ages, but unfortunately for us, did not leave his impressions. Theodore constructed both his Anatolian and his Hellenic identity as spatial categories. Space mattered a great deal. His Hellenism had a territorial and geographical dimension. He was interested in the meaning of Hellas, which could be Anatolia itself. For example, he asked a metropolitan bishop who was in Italy on a diplomatic mission to the papacy, I quote, "When are you coming back from Europe to Hellas? Are you going to Thrace and crossing the Hellespont? When are you going to look at Asia from the inside?" In another letter, Theodore viewed Hellas as extending beyond Asia Minor and encompassing Thessalonica, for example, areas in the Balkans. In his second oration against the Latins, he outlines the areas inhabited by the Hellenes. And his point of departure here is a climate theory inherited from ancient philosophers such as Aristotle and Hippocrates. So inhabiting a central location in the world, the Hellenes had a perfect mixture of temperaments and were able to gather every craft and knowledge, furthermore, from people around the world. And as an illustration of this point, he, in a characteristic way, drew sketches in his writings, and this is a sketch found in his second oration in the Latins. You see on your left a manuscript in the Vatican, which is 13th century, written very shortly after Theodore's death, and a 15th century manuscript from Oxford. So this little sketch, I'll show you the Oxford manuscript, in fact represents, and Theodore explains next to the sketch, how world travel worked and how Hellas was in the center. So you see small Greek letters at the end of two lines that cross each other. The Greek letter nu, Theodore explains, N, refers to Britain on the one end of the inhabited world. The Greek lambda is Spain, the kappa is Egypt, and the omicron is a mythical land called Aornis, meaning literally a land without any birds, which was located in India by the Roman geographer Dionysius Periegetes. In other words, the omicron in India is the eastern extremity of the world. At the center, which Theodore called Point Alpha, lies Hellas. For someone who travels from Spain to Egypt, it was necessary that he would pass through the center, that is, through Hellas, as would a traveler who would go from Britain to India. Now, this drawing of world travel is simple and sketchy, but it's not fully imaginary. It reflects a certain broadening of geographical horizons as a result of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol world. Travel from Spain to Egypt via Hellas, that is through the eastern Mediterranean, reflects the normal patterns of sailing along the northern rather than the southern coast of the Mediterranean, patterns which are caused mostly by the prevailing winds and sea currents. Now, why did Theodore pay so much attention to the geography of Hellas? The likely explanation has to do with a third way in which his Anatolian and Hellenic identity were similar and intertwined. Both were the result of the conspicuous absence of Constantinople from Theodore's mental map. He does mention Constantinople passingly in letters and other writings, for example, when referring to the fall of the Queen of Cities, as Constantinople was known, or to the new political realities that emerged after the year 1204. He seems to have considered the recapture of Constantinople to be a worthy goal, even though he never mentions this as part of his agenda. Certainly, people around him hoped that he would become the emperor who would restore the city into Byzantine hands. In the absence of the ideological pulling force of Constantinople, the city of New Rome, regional identities gained prominence among the Byzantine elite, especially in Anatolian exile. And Theodore belonged to a generation born after the fall of Constantinople, which had never seen Constantinople with their own eyes. He viewed Anatolia as his own homeland and as a prosperous area with a stable frontier. His encomium on the city of Nicaea is remarkable for presenting Nicaea as the queen of cities, just as Constantinople, and for contrasting Nicaea to Constantinople's failure to provide the necessary protection to its population in 1204. This Nicaean patriotism was by necessity limited geographically, and it did not correspond to the needs of a state that was quickly expanding into the Balkans. Let me go back to the map reflecting the realities of 1257. On the basis of theories found in Greek philosophy, Hellenism was able to assume the attribute of Constantinople, namely its central position of the inhabited world. Constantinople was known in Byzantium as the Eye of Ecumene. Now Hellas became the center of the inhabited world because Constantinople was not under Byzantine control. This search for new identities and ideologies was a direct response to the need of a particular period in Byzantine history. And with the recapture of Constantinople in 1261, less than 3 years after the death of Theodore Lascaris, this chapter in the history of Byzantine thought, with this particular configuration of ideas, was forever closed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dimitar, for this very informative, inspiring lecture, which is very relevant also to our center, I mean, to a new center being opened in Turkey. Now, our next speaker, I'm sorry, I need to... Okay, so our next speaker is Maria Mavrudi. Now, Professor Maria, and let me introduce her also. Professor Mavrudi received her PhD in Byzantine Studies at Harvard in 1998. She's now professor of Byzantine history and classics at the University of California, Berkeley, at UC Berkeley, where she's been teaching since 2002. Between 2006 and 2008, she also taught at Princeton University, and in the Department of History, right? Now, her research focuses on the contacts between Byzantium and the Arabs, the medieval reception of ancient Greek learning in the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, bilingualism in the Middle Ages, the history of Byzantine science, Byzantine intellectual history, and the survival and transformation of Byzantine culture after 1453. Her books include her 2002 publication called A Byzantine Book on Dream Interpretation, which was on a book on the Onirokritikon of Ahmet and its Arabic sources, published by Brill. A second book, which is a source translation of a dream book, also published in 2002. She has also co-edited with Paul Magdaleno a book called The Occult Sciences in Byzantium, which was published in 2007. And she's also the author of numerous articles. And currently, Professor Mavrudi is working on a book on bilingualism in Greek and Arabic in the Middle Ages, entitled Evidence from the Manuscripts. Among her awards, in 2001, 2001, she was a fellow at Dumbarton Oaks. In 2001-2002, she was the Anna Seeger. I seem to have lost one of my pages. Okay, she was the Anna Seeger Davis Postdoctoral Teaching Fellow in Hellenic Studies at Princeton University. In 2004, she received the MacArthur Fellowship, which was, of course, a very great achievement. And in 2007, she received a Humboldt Fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, which she ended up deferring and declining due to lack of sabbatical leave from UC Berkeley, unfortunately. So today she's going to lecture to us on Byzantine philosophy and science at the court of Mehmed the Conqueror. So please, Maria, I invite you to the floor.
I just want to say that I'm very honored and deeply moved to be here today on such a happy occasion for Byzantine studies in Turkey. Exploring the areas in which late Byzantine and early Ottoman history intersect is a difficult but extremely important task for an obvious reason. Current conventions of historical periodization count the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans in 1453, along with the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus in 1492 and the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg at around the same time, as events that mark the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period. If we accept these conventions, it should logically follow that understanding the transition from a Byzantine to an Ottoman reality is key to understanding the advent of modernity. And yet, both Byzantium and the Ottoman world are thought to have participated to modernity only minimally. Byzantium as a marginal player, and because of its collapse, by providing manuscripts of the ancient Greek authors and teachers of the ancient Greek language to the European humanists in the course of the 15th century. The Ottoman Empire as a follower rather than a leader, experiencing shreds of modernity through incremental and generally short-lived episodes such as Ibrahim Mutafarrika's printing press and Piri Reis's maps. The reason is obvious. From the point of view of modern Western historiography that sought to teleologically explain the global economic and political preponderance of the Western world into the second half of the 20th century, both Byzantium and the Ottoman Empire represent models of civilization that ultimately failed. In spite of Justinian or Basil II, Byzantium could not avoid 1453. In spite of Mehmed the Conqueror or Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire ended up as the so-called sick man of Europe. Admiration towards the Byzantine and the Ottoman empires, whenever extended, is on account of their administrative and institutional structures. The Byzantine Empire has received positive press for its preservation of Roman law, and occasionally, though far from always, its sophisticated centralized bureaucracy. The unfathomable complexities of this bureaucracy were presumably also part of the Byzantine state's weakness, a modern perception that resulted in a pejorative meaning for the term Byzantine in current English usage. Likewise, modern historiography has praised the Ottomans for being capable administrators, at least some, though not all of the time. Neither the Byzantines nor the Ottomans are ever praised for their intellectual achievements, even at what are deemed as the best moments of their empires. Their philosophy and science is generally assumed to be derivative of earlier, better models. Overall, Byzantine intellectual production is viewed as an inferior imitation of its ancient Greek antecedent. Ottoman philosophy and science is presumably dependent on, and never manages to do any better than, Arabic philosophy and science of the classical Islamic period, that is up to the 12th century maximum. The reason is that ancient Greek and classical Arabic philosophy and science, but not their Byzantine or Ottoman counterparts, are viewed as contributing elements foundational to modern Western civilization. The until recently dominant narrative on the history of Western civilization goes roughly as follows. Ancient Greek philosophy and science were received and further developed by the Romans in antiquity. Later, when the Greek and Latin-speaking worlds are supposed to have entered the darkness of the Middle Ages, they were also received by the Islamic world through the Greek into Arabic translation movement of the 9th and 10th centuries. The Muslims are credited with preserving the Greek substratum of philosophy and science when it was extinguished elsewhere, and with further building upon it with their own contributions. In the 12th century, this originally Greek material, together with its Arabic accretions, was received in the Latin West through a wave of Arabic into Latin translations, an event of major significance for bringing about what Western medievalists have called the 12th century Renaissance, a Renaissance before the Renaissance. The recovery of ancient Greek philosophy and science in the Greek originals, and no longer through the inferior Arabic versions, through the westward migration of Byzantine intellectuals and their manuscripts in the 15th century, is viewed as a foundational event leading to European modernity. The rise of political and economic powers challenging the preponderance of the West after the end of the Cold War, China, India, compounded with pre-existing developments generated by the dismantling of European colonial empires from the 1950s onwards, did have scholarly repercussions. During the last 20 years or so, scholars have sought to rehabilitate a host of former underdogs. Within what interests us tonight, they have begun to emphasize the value and originality of Byzantine and Ottoman commentaries and other interventions on the bodies of earlier classical Greek and Arabic literary production. Part of the inspiration was provided by the somewhat earlier rehabilitation of medieval Latin philosophical and scientific activity, including its production of commentaries. Still, what this ultimately means for our broader assessment of the Byzantine and Ottoman civilizations and their position in world history has not been fully spelled out yet. The modern political adventures I just outlined are mirrored in the way scholarship since the 19th century has investigated the field of human endeavor in which the Byzantines and the Ottomans were presumably at their best: legal institutions and fiscal administration. Since a state depends on effectively collecting taxes, the conquerors of a territory need to become immediately acquainted with the fiscal terminology, registration techniques, and practices of the conquered in order to survive. This is patently clear from the documented continuity of Byzantine and Sasanian fiscal practices after the Arab conquests of the 7th century, and the use of fiscal documents found in the Byzantine capital by the Crusaders in order to distribute among themselves the lands of the empire after they conquered Constantinople in 1204. Modern scholars tried to assess the degree to which Turkish polities in Anatolia before the establishment of the Ottoman Empire, as well as the Ottomans afterwards, adopted the existing Byzantine administrative institutions of the conquered territories. Western scholars visiting the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century in various capacities readily observed the resemblances between Ottoman and Roman law with which they were familiar, and concluded that Ottoman institutions depended on earlier Byzantine ones. For example, the French historian and politician Alfred Nicolas Rimbaud, who wrote on Byzantine, late modern French, and Russian history towards the end of the 19th century, proposed that the Ottoman fetihnamehs, letters announcing important conquests to allies and enemies, were modeled after Byzantine examples that were themselves inherited from the Roman epistolae laureate. The Russian Byzantinists Fyodor Uspensky and Vladimir Benesevich witnessed Ottoman fiscal practice in the course of fieldwork in the Ottoman provinces, especially Mount Athos, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. They called attention to its similarity with Byzantine fiscal practices recorded in surviving late Byzantine documents. The political underpinnings of such scholarly views are not difficult to discern. The assertion that Turkish administrative practice was effectively copied from earlier Christian practices in the same areas can be seen as yet another articulation of the overall colonial attitude towards Islamic civilization that denied its originality and presented it as an imitation of earlier Western, whether pagan Greco-Roman or Byzantine Christian, ideas and practices. Such a historical position was particularly provocative to Turkish nationalists during the painful years that led to the end of the Ottoman Empire and the birth of the Turkish Republic, when the Christian powers of Europe were undermining the political stability and territorial integrity of the Turkish motherland. This was the time when the eminent Turkish intellectual and politician Mehmet Fuat Köprülü began his scholarly and political pursuits. Köprülü research encompasses several aspects of Turkish folklore as well as legal and administrative practices. This follows the position of Friedrich Karl von Savigny and the 19th century German historical school of jurisprudence. Law expresses the spirit of a people, Volksgeist, in the same way as language, manners, and customs. Köprülü, grounded in a profound knowledge of the primary source material in Oriental languages, argued against the dependence of early Turkish administrative practices on their Byzantine counterparts. His work, a significant contribution to the ideological foundation of Turkish nation building, was much admired by Mustafa Kemal and Ziya Gökalp. These binary approaches to the sources of early Turkish administrative and fiscal practices, which were influenced not only by the modern political realities on the ground, but also the body of source material that individual scholars were acquainted with. Later scholars sought to nuance them. Spiros Vrionis pointed out that Köprülü effectively demonstrated the Islamic provenance of many, but not all, Ottoman institutions, and that an informed comparison of Byzantine and Ottoman institutions was hampered by the insufficient investigation of the Paleologan period, the Seljuks and Beyliks of Anatolia, and the Ottoman rise until the conquest of Syria and Egypt. Vrionis argued that Turkish institutions, both pre-Ottoman and Ottoman, represent a new synthesis of three elements: Islamic, Turkish, and Byzantine. He also underscored that the Islamic administrative models imported by the Turks to Anatolia were compatible with the pre-existing Byzantine ones because Islamic models were ultimately derived from Byzantine and Sasanian practice after the 7th century. For the Ottoman period, Halil İnalcık argued that its agrarian tax structure in Western Anatolia and a good part of the Balkans was closely modeled on its Byzantine counterpart. A number of scholars repeatedly observed that the format and physical appearance of at least some Ottoman documents resemble those of their Byzantine counterparts as well. More recently, continuities and changes were jointly explored by Byzantinists and Ottomanists. This research focuses on regions for which we still have cadastral registers, or at least narrative sources, from both the Byzantine and the Ottoman period. In other words, there is emphasis on the better documented cases. It is hoped that the ongoing publication of Greek, Arabic, and Ottoman documents from Mount Athos, the most complete surviving archival record of Byzantine fiscal practice during the Paleologan period, fragmentary as it is, will allow us to better discern continuities and changes in this Balkan region. The study of the contact between Byzantine and Ottoman philosophy and science is not nearly as advanced as the study of contact between Byzantine and Ottoman administrative institutions, but it is hampered by many of the same ideological and practical constraints. The opportunity for communication between Byzantine and Ottoman philosophy and science is generated by the Greco-Roman substratum that they both shared through reading many of the same authors: Aristotle, Plato and his late antique interpreters such as Plotinus and Proclus, Ptolemy and Galen, that were made available in Arabic primarily through the Greek to Arabic translation movement. Byzantine and Ottoman scholars were aware that they shared this background. This is explicitly mentioned by Emperor Manuel Paleologos when he recorded the series of debates that he held with an unnamed Muslim scholar. Manuel calls him Muderris, teacher, and his sons. The debates took place in Ankara around 1390-1391. Manuel comments that both he and the Muderris acknowledged the importance of Aristotle for their philosophical grounding. But Manuel found that the Muderris' Aristotle had been disfigured beyond recognition in the course of migrating into Muslim thought. Manuel does not mention whether the Muderris found the Byzantine Aristotle equally irrecognizable. Later in the Ottoman period, and after the end of Byzantium's political existence, Muslim scholars aimed at reaching a new understanding of ancient Greek authorities through recourse to the Greek originals. For example, the 16th century Syrian physician Daoud el-Antaki studied the Greek language in order to access Greek medical authors in the original. During the Tulip period, the Ottoman scholar Esad el-Yanyaoui, dissatisfied with the early Abbasid translations of Aristotle, learned Greek from certain Greek functionaries in the Ottoman administration with the aim to translate anew into Arabic some Aristotelian treatises. The possibility of contact between Byzantine and Ottoman science in the late medieval period was first proposed during the late 19th century, but has not been pursued much further and has occasionally been dismissed. The earliest modern effort to discuss Ottoman science as a coherent whole is by the physician and politician Abdulhak Adnan Adivar, husband of the famous author, nationalist, and women's rights advocate Halide Edip, belonging to the same generation as Mehmet Fuad Köprülü. His La Science chez les Turcs Ottomans was published in 1940. Adivar quotes in some detail the evidence surveyed by European Orientalists indicating the possibility of contact between Byzantine and Turkish science, but dismisses it. The reason is, it seems to me, that he sees a sharp difference between advanced European science and a more backward Ottoman science. As he put it, translating from his French and keeping close to his wording, although at the universities of Europe instruction was limited to the trivium and the quadrivium, learned men like Grosseteste, Robert Bacon, Albertus Magnus, Regiomontanus, and Nicholas of Cusa deemed it necessary to go to the Greek and Arabic sources. They looked everywhere for manuscripts and even invited the last Greek philosophers of Byzantium to come to Europe in order to prepare, perhaps, the renaissance of modern science. In contrast, the Turks that were, since the first half of the 12th century, in direct contact with Byzantium, had no interest in the intellectual life of this empire. Not only did the Turks not feel the need to do research in the sources of Greek and Hellenistic science, they did not even consult the greatest Arabic works. Adivar complains that instead of going directly to the great classics, either translated such as Ptolemy's Almagest or original like Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Biruni, and Ibn Sina, the Ottomans were happy to simply comment on them. Nowadays, Adivar's assessment appears unfair and poorly informed for several reasons. Towards the end of the 20th century, scholars in various fields studying late antiquity and the Middle Ages, Greek, Latin, or Arabic, began to value commentaries as vehicles of original knowledge and as effective ways of intervening and updating existing knowledge. Further, the more positive evaluation of Islamic science in the post-classical period after the 12th century began several decades ago. The rehabilitation was triggered in the 1950s by the gradual realization that certain models of planetary motion proposed in the 13th and 14th centuries by astronomers such as Nasir-eddin Tusi and Ibn Shatir are very close to those of Copernicus. Nasir-eddin Tusi was the first head of the observatory built in 1259 by Hulagu in Maragha, today East Azerbaijan province of Iran. It was abandoned in the middle of the 14th century, but its tradition continued in Tabriz, built while Maragha was still functioning, and later in Samarkand, wherefrom it was brought to Ottoman Constantinople during the reign of Mehmet the Conqueror. Around 1472, Mehmet the Conqueror invited Ali al-Kusci to the new Ottoman capital. Kusci arrived with his family and students and worked there until his death in 1474. Ali al-Kusci is credited with opposing the principles of Aristotelian physics and metaphysics and considering a moving earth as a possibility. These are deemed as important steps towards a modern European astronomy. The problem then becomes whether the strides of medieval Islamic astronomy were known to Copernicus, and if so, how? Since Copernicus did not read Oriental languages, but definitely read Greek, the link between Maragan and Copernican astronomy was identified in Byzantium. Since the end of the 19th century, we are aware of a number of translations from Persian and Arabic into Greek, whereby elements of Maragan astronomy, astrology, and medicine were transferred to Byzantium during the end of the 13th and the 14th centuries. The best known among the Byzantine translators and practitioners of this material is Gregory Chioniadis, born around 1240 or 1250 and still active after 1315. He studied astronomy and clearly also astrology in Tabriz, where he later served as bishop. For a while, he kept traveling between Tabriz, Trebizond, and Constantinople, and appears to have had connections with other scholars at all three places. There can be no doubt that the Maragan tradition was absorbed in Byzantium as part of mainstream practice by the second half of the 14th century. Proof is the fact that the astronomical compendium titled Trivivlos Astronomiki by Theodore Melitiniotis, which included a long exposition of Persian astronomy, was used as textbook at the Patriarchal Academy around this time. Since the translated Persian and Arabic materials of the Maragan tradition include astrology and medicine, they were obviously relevant not only to the mathematical aspects of Byzantine astronomy, but to a whole range of fields within natural science. The exploration of concrete problems within the natural sciences, such as mathematically modeling planetary motion, could have important implications about theology, and here is how. In the Physics of Aristotle, a text foundational to both Byzantine and Islamic philosophy, Aristotle examines what brings about change or motion. Since it is not possible for anything to come out of nothing, it follows that the very concept of introducing change or movement in the universe proves that God exists. And then you begin to have a series of problems of how motion is connected with God. We do not yet understand what the importation of Maragan natural science implied for Byzantine philosophy and theology. But it is clear that some first-rate Byzantine intellectuals were bothered by the knowledge imported from the Islamic world and dismissed it as nonsense. Modern scholarship has not yet sorted out what strand or strands of the Maragan tradition came to Byzantium, how it was reinterpreted in order to meet Byzantine needs, and what exactly some Byzantine intellectuals, but not others, found objectionable. Likewise, we do not yet understand how the work done in the Maragan mathematical sciences affected Maragan theology. Further, we have not yet assessed the role played by the Arabic translations of ancient Greek originals in the formation of the Maragan tradition. As pointed out by Jamil Rageb, among Atussi's most important and enduring contributions to the mathematical sciences were his recensions of Greek and early Islamic scientific works, which in many ways revitalized the translation movement of 9th century Baghdad. This included Euclid's Elements, Ptolemy's Almagest, and treatises by Euclid, Theodosius, Hypsicles, Autolycus, Aristarchus, Archimedes, Menelaus, Thabit ibn Qura, and the Banu Musa. Tussi often included insightful and original commentary and provided an opportunity for generations of students of late medieval Islam to study and absorb the Greek scientific tradition, either with or without the help of a teacher. This latter point takes on added significance in view of the absence of an ongoing institutional structure for teaching the ancient sciences. A modern complication in discerning the true impact of the Maragan tradition in the Islamic and Byzantine worlds is the fact that, at least since the 19th century, the so-called rational sciences were brandished as evidence for the greatness of Islamic civilization. Accordingly, modern reassessments of post-classical Islamic science, as not in decline but flourishing, have focused on its mathematical and rational aspects. However, key scholars in the Maragan tradition, including Tusi, were also cultivating astrology and other forms of knowledge beyond what we consider today as the rational sciences. For example, Tusi's reworkings of the ancient classics include the study of the Karpos, a hugely successful compendium on astrology and divination attributed to Ptolemy that is known in Greek, Arabic, and Latin versions. Tusi edited the Arabic text and explicated it with a Persian commentary. Concerns of rationalism have also dominated the modern study of Islamic philosophy. The modern study of Tusi's philosophical work, which includes, for example, an ethical and eschatological guide on how to travel from the physical to the spiritual world, has been complicated for this reason. Tusi wrote most of his philosophical treatises in an Ismaili environment, with which he later came into conflict. Modern scholars invested in Tusi's rationalism are uneasy with his Ismaili orientation and interpret his sectarian shifts as proof of his ultimate commitment to rationalism. To the best of my knowledge, nobody has yet articulated how Tusi's work on mathematical models of planetary motion, the main reason for which he received attention in the modern world, relates to his philosophical and theological teachings. What is politically at stake in the modern world when investigating the philosophy and science of the past is evident when we look at the range of modern approaches to the philosophy of Averroes, famously received in the Latin West through the philosophy and theology of Thomas Aquinas, and less famously, also received in Byzantium through Greek translations from Aquinas' Latin prepared between the 13th and 15th centuries. The philosophy of Averroes attracted the positive attention of modernity because of its emphasis on arguments derived from reason. Ernest Renan, in the 19th century, credited with generating the European Enlightenment. Modern Arab secularists in the 20th century insisted that Averroes clearly distinguished between philosophy and religion, leading to a separation of religion and state, and launched free rational thinking in Europe. Modern Arab Muslim traditionalists held that he did not separate religion from philosophy, but negotiated the relation between the two. These points of view have greatly emphasized Averroes' rationality because of its obvious political implications for the present. Choosing between arguments derived from reason versus religious revelation is part of a larger philosophical problem on which Mehmet the Conqueror had commissioned treatises by two well-known 15th century scholars, Hoxha Zadeh and Ala-Eddin Tusi. They were invited to judge who had been right in the 11th and 12th century dispute between Averroes and Al-Ghazali on the relationship between religion and philosophy. Hoxha Zadeh, Al-Ghazali's champion, was declared the winner of the debate, while Ala-Eddin Tusi, the proponent of Averroes, was so shamed by his defeat that he left the imperial city and never returned. The intellectual history of the reign of Mehmet the Conqueror is fraught with incidents that modern historians have a hard time interpreting. Inevitably, modern political considerations are reflected in the attempts of historians to assess Mehmet the Conqueror's personal, cultural, and political orientation. Western Orientalists, such as Emil Jacob, viewed him as a promoter of philosophy and science interested in Greek and Latin classics under the influence of the Italian Renaissance. Turkish scholars, such as Halil İnalcık, insisted that he was thoroughly Muslim and that his interest in the culture of his contemporary Christians derived from his desire to become their conqueror and ruler. More recently, in an effort to disengage from the East-West tug-of-war, Anna Akasoi emphasized Mehmet the Conqueror's general interest in philosophy and science, in which he resembles earlier Eastern rulers, such as the early Abbasids and their sponsorship of the Greek into Arabic translation movement, or Western rulers like Frederick Barbarossa. For what remains of my time, I would like to focus on some concrete aspects of the interest in Greek philosophy and science at Mehmet the Conqueror's court, and see how they fit within specific Ottoman intellectual concerns at the time. We know that the surviving Arabic translations of at least 2 ancient Greek texts were commissioned by Mehmet the Conqueror, Ptolemy's Geography and the Chaldean Oracles. In the Geography, Ptolemy explains how to draw a world map using astronomical coordinates. He meant the Geography as a companion volume to his Almagest, his astronomical manual, the Tetravivlos, his astrological one, and the handy tables, used in both astronomy and astrology, but also in calculating the chronology of world history. For example, the Geography can help convert how an astronomical phenomenon cited and recorded in a given part of the world would have been visible in another. Such a conversion can help predict and describe planetary motion, which in modern terms is an astronomical project. But since the position of the planets is taken into consideration when casting horoscopes, the Geography can also help with astrological pursuits. Interest in studying the Geography in the early Ottoman period can be firmly placed within the exploration and critique of Ptolemaic astronomy evident in the Islamic and the Byzantine world since the 13th century, especially under Mauryan influence. It can also be understood as part of the Ottoman interest in cartography. Politically, it could serve as an articulation of Mehmet's success at conquering and his further aspirations for world dominion, especially as the translation project was accompanied by the construction of a world map in exceptionally grand scale. It can also serve the purposes of political propaganda through divination and apocalypticism, something that abounded in the Ottoman world during the 15th and 16th centuries. The other translated text, the Chaldean Oracles, is a pagan religious revelation compiled in verse in the 2nd century AD that later Neoplatonic philosophers studied and commented on for centuries. In the 15th century, it was edited and commented on by George Gemistos Plithon, the most famous among Byzantine philosophers in the modern period because of his impact on Florentine Renaissance Neoplatonism. The unique known manuscript with the Arabic translation of the Chaldean Oracles prefaces it with the following texts. A brief introduction by the translator that outlines a Muslim profession of faith and explains the motivation for this work. An excerpt drawn from the very beginnings of Plithos' Book of Laws, titled Summary of the Zoroastrian and Platonic Doctrines, and essentially a brief presentation of the role that various pagan gods, Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, the Sun, Kronos, the Titans, play in generating and sustaining the cosmos. And 3 chapters from Plithos' Book of Laws containing prayers and hymns to these same gods and others. Among Plithos' works, the texts chosen for this Arabic collection are very much those that could have assisted the practice of theurgy, the summoning of a divine agency to operate in human affairs. This was a prime purpose for which the Chaldean oracles had been employed since antiquity, and miracles performed with their help, or with the help of prophecy and magic of Chaldean inspiration, are recorded in ancient literature in connection with major and minor Neoplatonic figures. These miracles primarily involve relief from drought. At least in one instance, a theurgically induced rain saved the Roman army from thirst and secured its victory over the Quadi. Under this light, it becomes understandable why a collection of texts that could aid theurgy would be of particular relevance to a prince, especially one with urgent military concerns, which Mehmet the Conqueror had in the middle of the 15th century. Modern scholars have generally viewed the Arabic translation of the geography and the Chaldean oracles as 2 separate events, one belonging to pure science and the other to philosophical eccentricity or superstition. Yet it is possible to understand them as part of the same larger intellectual and political project. The Arabic translation of Plithos' works is informed by its philosophical context in both the Greek and the Arabic-speaking world. by translating prayers and hymns to the ancient gods that cannot be dissociated from their connection with the planets already made in the context of Babylonian astrology and exported to the Greco-Roman world since antiquity, the Arabic translator of Pletho is enriching a pre-existing Arabic literature on the topic. The most famous such example, and the only published one, is perhaps the 11th century Andalusian book on magic known as the Ghayat al-Hakim, translated into Latin already in the Middle Ages under the title Picatrix, which contains a long chapter describing the Sabaean ritual practices for procuring the powers of the planets. Other texts with prayers to the planets remain unpublished, but are known as part of the Hermetic corpus in Arabic. Proof that the Arabic translator of Pletho's texts is aware of the Hermetic literature in Arabic and views Pletho in its context are the translator's introductory remarks. There, he designates Pletho as pagan, Wathani, literally worshipper of graven images or idols, and further clarifies with the epithet Sabaean, Sabi. These characterizations, of course, reflect the accusations of paganism leveled against Pletho by Georgios Gennadios Scholarios, the first patriarch of Constantinople under Ottoman rule, appointed by Mehmed the Conqueror, which led to the public burning of the Book of Laws by 1462. More importantly, they convey the Arabic and Islamic context within which Pletho's texts can be rendered meaningful and useful. In a medieval Arabic and Islamic context, the Sabaeans are pagan worshippers, the licit existence of whom within an Islamic polity, and therefore their right to adhere to the religion without converting to Islam, is guaranteed by the Quran. In the 9th and 10th centuries, few among them are known as prominent scholars and scientists and translators of Greek material into Arabic, including Hermetic material, such as Thabit ibn Qura and his son Sinan. By the 12th century, they seem to have disappeared as a living community. The question of who exactly they were, what they believed, what their connection with the Greco-Roman heritage and its transfer into Arabic was, need not occupy us right now. To a 15th century educated Muslim, Sabaean would have meant a pagan with a licit existence among Muslims whose knowledge and rituals can assist in magic and divination. Pletho's Arabic excerpts closely correspond to specific philosophical interests pursued at the court of Mehmed the Conqueror and attested in the surviving manuscripts of his Arabic library. At least 3 manuscripts inscribed as copied for him contain works by the Persian 12th century philosopher Suhrawardi, whose legacy was particularly influential in Ottoman lands during this period, especially through its dissemination by Sufis. Both Pletho and Suhrawardi are concerned with some of the same questions, such as the process of divine illumination. The convergences in Pletho's and Suhrawardi's work originate in the Byzantine and Islamic reception of late antique interpretations of Platonic philosophy, and especially Plotinus. Books 4 to 6 of Plotinus's Enneads were translated into Arabic and were quoted in 2 texts that we know were consulted by 15th century Ottoman philosophers, the Letters of the Brethren of Purity and the so-called Theology of Aristotle. Suhrawardi also refers to the famous passage from the Enneads describing the journey of Plotinus's soul outside the body, its entrance to the place of splendor and light, and its return to the body, much like the Chaldean oracles in Pletho's edition. There is evidence that scholars at Mehmed the Conqueror's court read Pletho in conjunction with Suhrawardi. An important manuscript, still in the Topkapi collection, is inscribed as having been copied for the Library of Mehmed the Conqueror in the year 1461. It is a comprehensive edition of Suhrawardi's works that includes a sequence of prayers to 17 divine intellects and holy souls. The first prayer is addressed to Bahman, the first intellect and a high-ranking god in the pantheon of Zoroastrian divinities, so instead of Greek, now Persian paganism. An equivalent in Pletho's Book of Laws would be Poseidon. Though Pletho's system does not follow Suhrawardi's, a Muslim reader familiar with Suhrawardi's prayers would have recognized Plethos' Arabic translation as a text written in an understandable and relevant philosophical idiom. The Neoplatonist strands that Plethos' work shared with Islamic philosophy rendered it accessible and pertinent to 15th century Muslim thinkers. They found in it elements recognizable from Muslim sources and could use it to address concerns generated by Muslim philosophy. Once we concede that theurgy and magic as forms of natural science were parts of the research agenda at the court of Mehmet the Conqueror, his documented interest in figural representations and ancient statues that has puzzled modern scholars no longer looks like fascination with Western tastes or the result of an otherwise inexplicable personal eccentricity. Modern researchers on ancient and medieval magic know that throughout the centuries, pagan, Christian, and Muslim philosophers used figural representations and antique statuary as a kind of voodoo dolls in order to intervene on and control the physical world that surrounded them. Mehmet the Conqueror commissioned medallions and bronze sculptures to Italian artists. He also collected the ancient statuary that adorned Byzantine Constantinople, which for longer than a millennium the Byzantines had regarded as talismans and used as a means to control their own city's fortune. As pointed out by Julian Rabi, Mehmet the Conqueror had the great bronze equestrian statue of the Augusteon pulled down from its 100-foot-high column outside Hagia Sophia on the advice of his astrologers, who warned him that the rider was a talisman of the city. For the Turks, it was a maleficent object. Vice versa, a beneficent talisman, the snake-preventing serpent column in the Hippodrome, was preserved by Mehmet. Legend claims that he broke one of the serpent's jaws with his mace. But this is unfounded, whereas there is good evidence that he had a mulberry tree, which was growing dangerously close to the column, cauterized to its roots. Mehmet's recorded interest in Constantinople's monuments, and especially Hagia Sophia, could also be understood in this vein. Mehmet is known to have collected oral and written records of the building's history, questioning Greek priests and ordering translations of Greek works on its construction and the founding of Constantinople. Several Turkish and Persian versions are recorded from the late 1470s, some commissioned and/or dedicated to the Sultan. Mehmet's interest in Constantinople's talismans and his collection of Christian relics, because he had such a thing, share their ability to perform miracles. Miracles were extensively discussed in Ottoman Kalem of the 15th and 16th centuries. They were also examined in the writings of Gennadios Scholarios, the first patriarch of the Ottoman period, who was indisputably in dialogue with Muslim philosophers and theologians at Mehmet's court. The Sultan ordered him to write at least 3 theological treatises that were also translated into Arabic. Further, miracles were hugely important in the theological discussions that took place in Europe at around the same time as a result of the Catholic Protestant Reformation and Counter-Reformation. So all 3 worlds, Latin, Greek and Arabic, Ottoman, Persian-speaking, are having the same problems they are discussing. To sum up, Byzantine and Ottoman philosophy and science could and did communicate. Such a dialogue was feasible because of their shared foundation on Greco-Roman philosophy and science that they both kept revisiting and revising throughout the Byzantine and the Ottoman periods. They occasionally used each other's readings of the ancient heritage in order to renew their thought or antagonize one another as heirs of the ancient heritage. This is exemplified by the Byzantine appropriation of the Maragan tradition, which did not meet with universal approval in Byzantium. It is also exemplified by the Ottoman appropriation of Byzantine philosophical and scientific material at the court of Mehmet the Conqueror. This also did not meet with universal Ottoman approval. Molla Lutfi, an important figure in the Ottoman appropriation of Byzantine thought, Mehmed the Conqueror's librarian and keeper of his collection of Christian relics, was accused of magic and executed in 1494. Clearly, the process of exploring the other is rarely an entirely comfortable or even safe process. Why do it then? What is the reward? As those who have tried it know, the biggest reward when reaching out to engage with the other is learning something that is unknowable and unfathomable without this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Maria Mavrudi for this intriguing lecture, linking the intellectual life of Mehmed II's court with the Byzantine world, and the ancient Greek world. Now, we have some time for questions before our cocktail reception downstairs, so if there will be questions, we can take them. There's a mobile, the micro.
Thank you very much. More than a question, is related to the first lecture, excellent, of course, of the professor. First, okay, Raffaele D'Amato, Ferrara University, Italy, Fatih University, Istanbul, just to present me, okay. I suggest in any case to consider it in a different way the conception of Hellenism by Theodoros Laskaris in some of his expressions, because it's clear from all the text of all the letters, especially if you consider it from a military point of view, as I am a militarist about Byzantium study, that he's speaking about the Roman Empire. Hellenes are considered like something like ethnical questions. I mean, he is intending to say, we are Romans in a Rome, but the people is composing now the nucleus of the legitimate Roman Empire, and this is also the letter it was written to the West, are now Hellenes, because we receive the legacy of the Roman Empire. But not only we receive the legacy, we are the Roman Empire. That is true also because if you consider the previous, the successive analysis of Michael Paleologos about his troops, the new troops of Tsakones and other maritime troops that he created after the reconquest of Constantinople in 1261, he is speaking clearly that Tsakones are Roman citizens, but Hellenes by birth. So, according to me, my humble opinion, of course, is completely correct what the professor said, but I suggest to consider also his expression not always like a rival of the ideology of the Hellenism for what concerns the empire, just a punctualization of the Hellenic aspect of the Roman Empire, now strong and correctly, as professor said, in antagonism with the Latin possession of Constantinople. That is my opinion.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with what you're saying. Hellenism was another aspect of Romanitas, if you were. It was more ethnic, of course, and it had ethnic connotations, while Romanitas was more universalist and connected to Constantinople. So the two do not conflict each other, they complement each other, and that's that's one of the remarkable things about developments in identity, that such concepts start appearing and gaining prominence in this period. So, thank you.
So, sorry, can I ask you before you leave the chair? I would like to ask you just a question about your information on Alaaddin Keykubat. Because probably you used the German translation of Duda, I think. Yeah, but this has a small mistake, a well-known mistake, I think. Because Keykubat tells in his memoirs, B.C. I had suffered a lot and left for Leşker, Beleşker after. Leşker in Persian is soldier. And then he translated this as Feldlager. But the sentence and information has no sense.
Yes.
This is exactly your Laskers.
Yes.
So they are alive, and I don't know whether you would like to talk about it.
Well, what I would like, thank you very much for raising this issue, and of course we need to rely on Duda because Duda's translation is the one that is available. Let me just say that the name Laskaris was rendered as Lashkari in Persian texts, not only by Ibn Bibi but others as well. So it was a cultural translation. It was the name as well as simply a rendition of the name. Thank you for raising this. You can find this in many other Eastern texts.
Yeah, this is thank you for really very rich information. I'm impressed with them. I mean, especially your remarks on Nasruddin Tusi. But as far as I know, you talk about the conflict between Tusi and Ismailis. Is that right? Because as far as we know, he was in full accordance and even to a certain speaker of them, I mean. The second question is, you talked at last time wonderfully about Mullah Lutfi. I need the real information about it, if you can give me. Because what we know, Mullah Lutfi talked about the supremacy.
The what?
Supremacy of the Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah. He said, well, he is supreme, but I'm Muslim, of course. The last one is ours. So that caused the problem. They couldn't accuse him. So probably they talk about that one, I don't know. But anyway, Mullah was executed because of his heresy, I mean, Tanassur. And that would be a new idea and interpretation of yours. Thank you.
So the Nasir ad-Din Tusi's rupture with Ismailism is not something I invented. It's there, especially, I forget now the name of one of the ethical treatises that he wrote, and then he rededicated and revised, and the conclusions and all of that. This is the episode I was referring to. And it has made people uncomfortable regarding what he actually believed, and was he with Ismailism or not with Ismailism. It's, I don't know, do I answer your question? I'm not quite sure what I think you know all of this. Oh, okay.
If someone brings a very fast interpretation, I would appreciate it.
And as for Mullah Lutfi,
the Gardens of the Wisdom, there is a total Ismaili, but now you brought a new knowledge that was the conflict between Ismailis and Tusi. If you bring, some new material, I would
when we meet after this, I can give you my bibliography. And as for Mullah Lutfi, my basic source of information is the Shakaika Numania. I mean, there is talk there that his colleagues were jealous because he had a big salary and an exalted rank and all of that. And having studied magic also in the Byzantine context, I have come to realize that magic is an accusation that you throw at somebody when there is nothing concrete that you can stick on them. And then you find what doesn't quite fit with an orthodoxy, which you may even hastily slap together. And that's how you get rid of someone. So there is a price, that the way I see it is there's a price to pay with playing with toys that not everybody used to play with at the time.
Yeah, the last one. Yeah, this is the Lutfi, your side is the magic material.
Yes, and then, I mean, we can talk about, I mean, I don't want to bore everybody by giving such details, but we can talk happily.
Well,
the question is not to the speakers, but it is to the director of the research center. First of all, I want to congratulate Boğaziçi University in the person of your rector, and yourself as the director of the. You remember 20 years ago, I had made a wish that you establish such a center, and I'm so happy as a Greek origin Turkish citizen to see such, and probably as a inheritor of the Byzantine tradition. Anyway, the last Byzantine probably that is around, one of the last one. You mentioned the aims and the fields of the research areas for your center. It was the science, it was philosophy, it was fiscal policy, it was administrative condition. You didn't mention one very important area, which is not really my field, is the Byzantine music and the Ottoman music. It is a very rich inheritance from the Byzantine world to the Ottoman world, and particularly the ecclesiastical music is what has really shaped the so-called classical Turkish music. And I hope that you find researchers to do such studies. Okay, thank you.
We'll immediately add it on our agenda, but as you said, the important thing is to find the researchers to carry out this kind of research, because that's a very important and needed area.
I think it's about time, so let us thank our speakers once again, and downstairs. And thank you all for being here, and downstairs will be our cocktail reception.